So last week we talked about education. We were talking a little bit about how to improve it, make it more open to everyone in the world, um, with kind of a worldwide perspective, and also make it fun, kind of gamify education. So I did a lot of research this week on different apps out there, different potential ones. I sent you the one Classcraft. Did you have a chance to look at that at all?
Yeah, if I've looked at their pitch and what they're doing, yes.
Yeah, so it's mostly just for current education systems, like current teachers who have like normal classes and they're just trying to kind of, use this app to engage their kids a little bit more. But I was trying to look at it from a perspective of what if you did something like this, from the ground up for a whole new education system, and it seemed like it could have a lot of potential if you kind of looked at reinventing everything from the ground up with this kind of methodology, with the main thing in my mind being a good reward system where the people have a good incentive to go and learn and progress at whatever rate they're comfortable with, but faster is better. They get more rewards and more benefits, obviously, from doing more faster. So I tried to think. I was talking with my son a little bit about the types of rewards he might like, that would encourage him to educate. And I was thinking things like, if you can somehow connect like the marks or the benefits to some kind of popular game that everybody's liking, where you get experience in this education system, and that can somehow translate into gear or skins in Fortnite or some other random Warcraft type game that people love, so that you kind of have this connection between the two, where it just gives you an instant gratification reward for kind of doing a little bit extra educational type work and a little bit extra learning, or do well in a test of some kind. You'll get this thing that you can show off to your friends online, or you'll get some cool piece of armor or gear that will help you in a raid or to level up somehow. What do you think about that? Is that too hard to draw that kind of connection, or is that something we could aim for to try to connect? You'd have to connect our corporate gaming systems with our education gaming systems and somehow have some kind of incentives or monetary back and forth there that would connect them.
I have many different answers to that, so I just have to make sure that I don't forget any of them, because I think all the points are important. Because this is a new, uncharted terrain, in as much as, like you said, the systems attempted or created so far are limited, or they are not really from the ground up applying the principles to education, like the Classcraft. I watched it and what they're doing, and it's very literal transfer from like a computer game tropes to the classroom. So it's like the first most basic adaptation of those principles that you could think of, that you don't even like think away from the context of specific types of computer games, because it's not just
Right.
computer games in general. It's very modeled after RPG fantasy type MMORPGs. So I
Yeah.
imagine World of Warcraft type stuff,
Yeah.
which it's like one of my reactions is, like you said, like connecting it with our corporate gaming type of systems. It already, there's one kind of problem, which is that they're usually designed sort of in a predatory fashion to like do a hostile takeover of people's attention and time
Right.
and money and stuff. So if you just connected it as it is, it would probably enhance some of the less constructive corporate systems in the society, or their negative effects on people potentially. It's like one response is, I don't think you should be doing it literally, just applying World of Warcraft style gimmicks to education. I don't think it should be just connected to games as they are now necessarily,
Mm.
especially massive multiplayer games, because there's a lot of problems with their design in terms of the effects that they have potentially on children, and that's not even saying anything about stuff that was actually controversial, like violence in games and stuff. Which I personally, I don't think like no, I don't think anybody will, and there's a lot of research suggesting like don't nobody will become mass murderer because they're like shooting pixels in a game. That's a
Mm.
different thing. Like the person would have to be predisposed, I believe, would have to be predisposed to be violent to make that connection, even that has any sort of direct connection with real life violence, because it doesn't really have any obvious connection with real life violence. It's more of a I think the research that exists leans more to the like it's a bit of a release escape mechanism where it may make people actually less violent in real life because they have an outlet for their frustrations. It's like more where I'm leaning and where I think the research is leaning. So that wouldn't even be like the biggest issue, even though it uses sort of violent tropes. Like Classcraft is like adopting even like the violent, like losing HP. Like it was one of the things was that like the student is losing HP. I don't think that's the best metaphor to use. But again, that's relatively minor compared to just like the addictiveness of like that's like sort of malicious and mean of some of those. It's called Skinner box, like those by social science, behavioral social science inspired mechanisms to like it's like a cage. It's just like to capture people in it and not make them psychologically capable of escaping. So that's one dimension of problems. Another one is that if you do it just like as simplistically as Classcraft did it, which I'm still like all for people innovating in this area and trying out stuff, but I do see some potential hiccups and problems if you were to use something exactly like Classcraft and try to apply it everywhere. And that's these people don't seem to be thinking too much ahead in terms of potential like for abuse of those mechanics or just how like it could sort of snowball in a negative direction, because they have mechanics like, okay, maybe if you have like study groups and if one person does something bad, the whole group is punished, loses some HP. And it's just okay that they sort of phrased it like they try to spin it in that it sort of motivates cooperation between students. It could also motivate them like bullying their weakest links into submission so that they are not all punished, because that's a bit of a like a collective responsibility, which is a thing that is not a part of legal systems in democratic liberal societies at all, because you shouldn't be like a punished because a member of your family did something. That's a really problematic principle at the core of that I'm pretty sure people at Classcraft didn't really think about at all, because they just looked at it, oh, it's fun, it's games, and didn't look at like, oh well, but some games are like fascism in real life. So because I have a whole article about how strategy games, especially like classic real-time or even the turn-based strategy games in like especially like futuristic space ones like StarCraft, how you're essentially a dictator in those games who has complete control over your whole population, which has to 100% do everything you want from them, which usually entails putting them into military service so that they genocidally eliminate all opposition. So it's like there's like a whole like levels of why that whole model of games is only fun if it's only a game and has no repercussions outside of it, which it could be a danger of making like using those systems and making them into education, especially in the way Classcraft does it, because they're sort of presenting their spin on it as a positive, that it's applied not on the subjects themselves but on the classroom dynamics. But that just makes it like if there's something flawed in that socially in that game design, it can manifest itself therefore in real life social relations, because you remove the separation between like it's not just a game. If like losing HPs means like that you may not eventually get a job that you want, then that becomes a very real thing that then will probably have the same negative aspects like the very real not democratic systems that people live in. So that's again, Classcraft specifically, I think they really need to think about it a lot harder, even though I'm not against the general concept. Also, I 100%, this is basically a long-winded way of saying, I 100% agree with you that it should be from the ground up, and it should be taking abstracts of these principles, like the principles in abstract, and applying them specifically to education, not by making education like a specific kind of game that already exists to the level of like genre details, but to just use the things that made games fun to make education fun. But those things existed before and outside of the games being what they are. Games could be without them also. You could have games that don't have these elements. So there's just a class of elements that can make a system of like people gaining information and achieving outcomes more or less fun. So that's like, let's look at what those like abstract principles are. and how to build a system from the ground up.
All right, that makes sense to me. I think I have a much better picture on some of the issues. So what the goal really is to make the learning itself fun, make it the learning itself the game, and not try to reward people learning by giving them, either game or monetary rewards of some kind, but to actually make the education itself its own reward, I guess. It's really hard to do, especially with certain things, like say someone doesn't like math or reading or whatever. As we're kids, you think of how kids might learn from the ground up. When they're 5 years old or 4 years old, you might read a book with them, and the reward is getting to cuddle with their parents or getting attention. They feel the happiness of reading because it connects them to people. That's the social dynamic of making the education fun. So maybe we need to kind of continue to expand from that perspective where, we talked last time about the study partner, where, you're just enjoying fun learning together. And if you have a partner that's kind of, you enjoy spending time with, you enjoy their attention, you're going to try to learn more and more together. So is that something that we need to focus a lot more on to kind of make education more fun? Is the social interaction of it? Or how do you apply that from a personal level to kind of make it fun for an individual to learn?
I think that my preferred way of how to do it wouldn't necessarily mean that it would have nothing in common with games, but now that I think about it some more, it's about re-enchanting those subjects, because the games also don't have to be science fiction or fantasy. That's those are another elements added to games to make them interesting, because you can have a completely boringly realistic game, and those are usually called simulators, which are so boring that some experts wouldn't even classify them as games, because if there's no objectives or rewards or specific strategies that make sense applying therefore to achieve goals, there's no sort of reinforcement of the enjoyment of the experience. So they're too much like, you can make a game so much like a sort of boring conception of real life that then it would be like declassified unclassified, or how do you say that? Those are maybe not the right words, but like it would stop being even described as game. So by like the sort of opposite token, if you have education, which usually is considered to be this like completely disenchanted, boring real life thing, or all the subjects like math, for instance, in it are sort of completely sort of disenchanted, and therefore people are just conditioned to have negative response just to the subject itself. You could re-enchant it by adding in elements of fantasy and or science fiction. So like fantastical elements or futuristic elements, or so something other than pure realism, because realism itself is a genre, a style. It's an idea. Realism is still a made-up thing, even like as a state of mind. That's just one of the ways to look at reality. It just turns out it's a very boring way to look at reality. So you could adopt a more fantastical way of looking at reality, but still including the same skills. Like in computer games, many of them actually include what's called grind. So chores that are not enjoyable. So it's like just go there and hit a thing over the head 500,000 times to get enough gold coins to buy a better thing to hit things over the head with, and that's not fun. That's even less fun than doing mathematics most of the time, objectively. But in the game, you would still be doing it and would even be able to enjoy it because of the context in which the whole activity is presented, or the goal toward which that whole activity is leading. Like people might be much more, are demonstrably in games, much more tolerant of chores, which could be in real life things like cleaning up your room or doing a mathematical exercise to many people. They could be tolerant of them if there's for instance, like they're part of a whole narrative of like you have to go through trials to earn some sort of like badge of honor or respect or an accomplishment or get a cool item or something. So there's a way in which you can present a chore that is objectively a chore. But for something like mathematics, mathematics inherently, objectively, are much more interesting than cleaning up your room. There's way more in it that I think is a lot about presentation. And the computer game systems, like it could include like cooperation in something like you can think of yourself as like Dungeons and Dragons party,
Mm.
meaning that you are a group of heroes that working together. I think that could be like a way to, that's the part of what the Classcraft is doing, that taking from those games, that I think is a good part, because that sort of exactly re-enchants sort of study group. Then like you're
Mm.
not just a study group, you're like a group of heroes, a band of heroes who's like on a quest to do something. And you can also re-enchant a task or a goal that you're supposed to accomplish as a quest, which can be like differently presented. Like you don't have to say like, and now just do a task and you get a grade. You can present that, like the narrative around it could be completely different. You can present it as a quest in an interesting way, like do like a bit of a, I don't know, poetry about it or something. It's like you have like a character doing voiceover and stuff, just like explaining it. And it's just like I'm making it a little bit about some story element, but the content of it would be 100% exactly the same thing. Like in many games, I don't even know how many times I have solved like some basic mathematical or logical puzzles, because there's
Mm.
like not, there aren't that many of like well established logical puzzles that you can like just think of necessarily, that people would immediately be able to intuitively understand and try to solve. And so all of those that exist, like you have these like three well, I guess sticks or pillars or something, and then you have rings of different widths, and you can only have like a wider ring below a thinner ring, like with a smaller circumference, and oh,
Mm.
not circumference, diameter, the smaller diameter. So, and there, so you're presented with them in some configuration, and then you have to be like switching them up until you get them from completely from one end to the other. So it's like one classic kind of puzzle that
Mm.
still like is a logical puzzle, and you could have like a mathematical equation as the puzzle of any kind that would be still exactly the same. It's just
Mm.
like, why are you solving it? What are you solving it for? Is the element that makes the difference in how people are enjoying or not enjoying doing the puzzle. So like this whole, it's all about motivation. From my point of view, it's all about motivating students, and the way that tasks are being framed contextually and presented in schools today is one of the like objectively worst ways of how you can do it, like one of the least motivational ways of how to present those tasks and make and try to convince people to solve them. That there's it's no wonder that people in general, students young and old, hate it and don't want to participate in it if it's presented to them in that way. And then you have subjects that are like completely interesting, which are for some reason that I don't really understand at all, completely downplayed in the major main most common educational systems, which are all the aesthetic ones. That you have
Mm.
like all the arts are sort of like
Yeah.
secondary to just like math and STEM fields, so-called STEM fields, natural
Yeah.
sciences, which if you focused a lot on those can be done in such like inherently interesting ways. If it's like music or creative writing or like debating or any of those arts that really engage people, that are interactive and stuff, so much
Mm.
so that you could use those like and make them the foundation, the spine of the system that connects everything, and
Mm.
attach those STEM things to them. So because like
Okay.
from the STEM things, from mathematics, it's much harder to get people to the arts than it is from the arts to get them to the STEM fields, which is something
Mm.
that popularizers of science have realized over the last few decades, which is sort of stunningly late. That it took them like most of the modern development of science and the scientific method and technological revolution, like almost when it was all over, that they've realized like, oh, and this is the way to how to communicate it so that people are actually interested in it. It's like in the last 20, 30 years. Think, oh,
Yeah.
maybe 40 max, like since Carl Sagan, who was like the first real, and so much so he was the first that sort of other astronomers were looking at him like, why are you doing this? Like, why are you sort of doing this like stupid talking about science to people so that they're interested in it? Like, why? Because they didn't care that like the population at large doesn't understand. They thought probably they couldn't understand anything or be engaged or involved. And it was possible. They just needed to lean into the arts, into storytelling, into
Okay.
creative writing, into public speaking, into music, and into animation, and into all of these like areas. They suddenly realized they need a lot of artists. to make that stuff interesting. And in like the last step of that whole evolution, even though that hasn't been done properly yet, I think, but it will inevitably, and it's into games. So like you could
Okay.
make, so the way I would put it, I think what you need to do with the education, with gamifying it, is not taking like some specific game that exists, like World of Warcraft, and just slapping it all over it. I think what you need to do is to turn education into the next its own unique Elder Scrolls. Like it's not
Okay.
like to be exactly the game that came before, it's to be its own new great MMORPG. Is essentially what I would put it.
Okay. I love that. Trying to picture exactly what that is tricky. So let me try for a sec. So let's just say we have a really good platform. We take all the online learning that's kind of out there. There's tons of these MMOICs, I guess, massive online courses that all the universities of the world are starting to kind of get bigger and bigger into. And then there's tons of course, Khan Academy and all these other, I think, pretty good courses for the most part where people can kind of learn individually. So say you kind of take that as your spine a little bit. And now you're just trying to build a system that essentially anyone in the world, any age in the world can kind of sign up for, whether they pay a subscription or whether your government pays a subscription. And you're just saying, okay, this is education now. And, maybe there's thousands of teachers out there that you can kind of choose a class to join that fits your desires and what you want to learn, or the classes you're trying to take. Or maybe you have to take, say, 4 or 8 different classes at any given time. And you're trying to kind of match your schedule, I guess, with all these other worldwide online classes. And then, so the bottom line is you kind of choose your class, you choose your speed, you choose what you want to be, and then all of a sudden you're in there. And you're interacting with the class, you're hearing from the teacher maybe on a one-on-one basis, and you're getting badges based on how much stuff you do, how much homework you do, the tests you do, and those badges are kind of a part of a badge of honor on your everyone has kind of a online degree, I guess, that kind of builds up as they go. And as part of that, you're trying to, like you said, create this whole new game around education that makes all of this stuff somehow connected and fun in a way that essentially the entire world is part of it and connected with it. Does that make sense so far?
It kind of does. I would have to say a few things to what I think is your conception of it, maybe like slightly, I think, off, like from what I
Okay.
think it should be about, which is that what you've described, it's definitely doable now. That's it's
Yeah.
definitely a place where you can start. But that would not be a spine. That would be a patchwork of the peripheries. What I mean by like the spine being something that connects everything is that like the spine is something that's missing now for this whole thing, and that's why it feels disconnected and is not contextualized together as one thing. Is that the spine would have to be the whole system of like how would I describe it? Like you would create like the Hogwarts at the center of it all, which is the overall context and narrative for the whole thing. So you already have people who can teach stuff, and you already have the peripheral places where you can go to do gamified exercise. That's like Khan Academy, I think, is the best example so far. Where even when I was just reviewing it for an article, I got hooked to do like a couple of math problems, just because of like the addictive gamified mechanics. So it's immediately demonstrating that it works because I'm like so old and so long from school, and I don't need to do any math exercises at all, and I still got hooked to do a couple. So that's just a complete proof to me that that's just by itself that's good. The problem is that in order to even present it, I think to like governments or to societies of people, to parents at large, it would have to be something that looks more unified. And
Yes.
while it shouldn't be centralized in principle, you probably still need if not center, you need a hub. I think you need to something, some institution or well structure or a system that not just connects it, like the most basic version, like a portal that you go to, which already is connected to all of those places. It's like the least, the most basic start of what the hub or the center of it is. But then it should be something where you have a system of that people can sort of like, as if you were like started a game, like loaded up a game, and there would be like already, you would see like the pathways, like you would see like I can choose these classes, and these, when I choose these classes, like these are the quests, sort of the structure of the like the quest that I can take up. You would see like, I think the if you want to be mythological, it would be the kind of the Yggdrasil. It would be like the tree that sort of like magic tree that connects all of these things, but which does have like a story and a description and a class or like a label for everything that exists, and the pathways are laid out before you. It's currently it's just a bunch of disparate things that don't feel connected, and it looks chaotic. Whereas like the one benefit that centralized education systems have is that the pathway is clear. Like this, like the whole, like the building, that's the building you go to. That's the desk you sit at. Those are the people in your class. Those are the teachers. These are the subjects. So it's like everything is like the narrative is in place for everything. It's just sort of a just like a sad pantomime of what learning could be, because it was like the first attempt at doing something like this that humankind did really to educate the masses. So unless you believe that like we got it right on the first try, it probably isn't. The expectation isn't that it's the best there could be. It's probably objectively testably something of the worst thing that could exist. But that's the thing that you need, except completely different. That for, like I said, you have to create the Elder Scrolls-like open world MMORPG of education, and which by itself, this whole thing that would have to be invented, doesn't include actually the teaching of anything. Yeah, those are the existing peripheries and people who can teach stuff that exist, and lecturers and stuff. The patchwork of people who exist already and stuff that we can access. But like again, the connective tissue. I just wanted to like after last time we discussed it, I wrote down some attributes of what the system would have to be. So I just like to be clear, I would just go through what I think are the elements of what the system would need to be. I tried to be complete and specific, but I probably missed something because it's not one of those things where I start from a clear numerological system that I would know how many options there have to be. I'm not at that level of understanding of it. So it's for now, it's just a laundry list of things. So to just be clear what I mean when I say, by the way, I invented a name for that. Like you said, we need a catchier title. So we could start like with project name something like Alternative World Education, which has a shortcut O. So that just throwing out there, that's a possibility. Okay, so what it would have to have as like the sort of the common core, but I don't want to use the word common core though, because like what common core is in America is a terrible thing for education. Do you know what it is?
Yeah.
So like the standardized testing sort of requirements, and that's like one of the times when I said like if you leave it to someone to come up with like, okay, so what are the tests, the standards that everybody has to pass, then you get something like the common core, and like the best teachers who win awards will quit over it, and kids will get like start vomiting in classrooms because they're so stressed about the exams, and those are real examples of things that keep happening because of it. So it's not a common core, no, because it's not about like one, like it's not in fantasy terms, it's not the One Ring. It's like one ring rules them all type situations. No, this is not the one thing that will control everybody. This is not what it's supposed to be. It's like I think like Yggdrasil, the Tree of Life. I think it's like a better example because there's many different branches connecting everything, so everything's connected, but there are multiple paths or ways to everything. So what it would have to be is definitely optional, like we discussed. It shouldn't be mandatory. It has to be open, which means without paywalls or other access restrictions. So there could be like people that would be paid for stuff, but ideally in society would pay from taxes or something to that effect. Like it wouldn't be like the individual kid would be prevented by a paywall to access anything. I think that would be a bad situation, or would be less than what it should be. It should be global, obviously, because with internet you don't have to and shouldn't make it nationalistic or ethnically segregated or any like group segregated in any way. Like in the same way you shouldn't like prevent like a particular nationality from participating. You shouldn't prevent a religious group. You shouldn't prevent a gender. You shouldn't just no, just don't discriminate anyone. Don't leave anyone outside of it. I think is the idea. But then also divergent. That means not standardized or authoritarian. So that's why it has to be multiple paths, and you choose the path that you go on. It's just there have to be some existing paths that make sense, but there should be so many of them that essentially everyone will be able to pick it. Because if there are just a few options, like you have one or two, then I think one of the Urza, the Czech anarchist, he used that example. I don't know what it was connected to, but that's like, yeah, you get a choice, and so like lunch at school, and you're a vegetarian, and you can pick between sausages and chicken. So it shouldn't be that. Like the choices need to be exhaustive, comprehensive, holistic. So meaning like all of those that actually exist and make sense, and therefore somebody would justifiably pick them. You shouldn't be leaving out anything. Then it has to be multi-generational, which means like not segregated by age. So it's not just like a batches, because I think the best explanation of how it's bad was that the idea of the kids of the same age being in the same classroom is like factory batches. You make a batch of products which only have in common that they're at the same time created at once. So that's a completely unbiological, anti-social idea that's just from the industrial revolution age. Then it has to be lifelong, meaning that like this doesn't have an endpoint. It's not like and you've learned enough, and you don't have to or can't participate in it anymore. So without age requirements or endpoints. Self-paced, meaning again, like at the speed at which you progress has to be your own, like in any computer game. It has to be collaborative, of course, like some people enjoy doing some things alone, but it definitely should be collaborative in a sense which is prevented in schools, because in schools that's called cheating. That you shouldn't collaborate, which is completely anti-real life. So that element should be that's actually in the games very common. We have the parties, the groups that cooperate. It's very common and make good idea. And I'm like halfway through the list. Then it's gamified, of course, in general, focused on motivating tasks. Current, meaning that you shouldn't be ignoring like last 50 years of research or contemporary culture just out of spite or complete ignorance, like is normal. Customized, meaning that it's like all computer games, not always exactly the same for everybody. It should be adapting to the preferences and the nature of the student. Then it should also be advisory, meaning it's not just opaque diploma mill. It's not just that, he got a degree, therefore he knows things. Advisory also should mean that it's not that if you don't do this test, you're done. It's advisory means like the current progress in any directions or in any skills can be tracked all the time in these systems. So you can look into the character sheet, the personal profile of the person, and you would see not just generally that they've passed the program. You would see how good they are at any particular skill. So that's like the CV on steroids, essentially. That would actually be informative to employers and potential collaborating people. Then I'm almost done. Collegial, which means without seniority-based privileged hierarchy. That means that like you can acknowledge that somebody knows more about a certain topic because it will be obvious in the trials they've passed and in their character level or skill points or whatever, however you choose to visualize it in those personality profiles. You would see who's better at something objectively to the extent to which something can be determined objectively. And you could also see who's more popular, which should be treated as a separate category, meaning like, or by popular consensus of their peers better at something in things that are more subjective. So you can like see all the different skills, because the expectation is that different types of people, personality types, can be vastly different in different tasks or in different areas of experience. And it shouldn't be like, this person is bad at math, therefore nobody should listen to them ever, and they can't become like a senior member of academia, as it is often is today, because there could be some sort of these walls of like requirements that could completely disqualify somebody who thinks differently than the preferred type of thinker. So that should be gone. So collegial means like your colleagues, meaning like a kind of peer in academic sense, meaning that you don't nobody would have like authority to end somebody's career or to stop somebody's grant funding like any individual person. So that in that way it should be more, the control should be more distributed,
Yeah.
more democratic. And then
Democratic.
integrated, meaning without rigidly separated subjects, because that's also a real thing that's ignored by schools, that there is no such real thing as subjects. And finally, even though you can like call different skills by specific names, but the interactiveness of things, like the possibility of combining unique things together, in most game systems that's considered to be the better thing to do, because in
Mm.
real life it's the more difficult, the more rewarding thing to do. So my example would be when I was in university. I studied two fields combined. I studied, technically it was a combination of fields, but practically the people teaching those two fields were completely walled off, separated from each other, and didn't have any idea how to cooperate. So that was hilarious, because it was media and political science, which have obvious connections that are like, obviously there are borderline issues that are very important issues, the more today than back then even. But I had difficulty whenever I tried to propose that I will be writing a paper on the borderline or combining the two, because who of them would lead like me, like be my, I don't know how to say it in English, like when you write a thesis, there's somebody who like oversees you
Yeah.
while you're writing it. And so that person, like, who would it be? They didn't know, because like for either camp, half of the things that I wanted to deal with in that paper were outside of their expertise. So they
Mm.
would totally like completely unheard of that it would be like two, one from each, so that they can cover it or something. That just occurred to me now, because like back then or in schools today, especially in the Czech Republic, that's impossible. You couldn't have like a joint like supervisors on your paper if it's interdisciplinary. It would just the solution in real academia today is to try to discourage people from trying to do interdisciplinary work. So that's something that, again, in
Okay.
computer games, gamified systems is obvious thing to do and very easy to do, and you should do it. And
Mm.
finally, so far, I maybe came up with something additional later. Respectful, meaning not treating students like second-class citizens,
Mm.
which I think is like
Yep.
so far the last and I guess the fundamental one. So that was a lot of information, but that's like, if I say that like we were actually trying to develop something, and I say that
Yeah.
I would like to have a gamified system from the ground up built, applied to education, these are the elements that it would need to have to be what I mean when I say it.
I really like it. Just listening to all of them, definitely nothing that I disagree with. I think the only challenge is, again, taking what we have now and somehow starting something new from scratch and getting enough. It's a chicken and egg a little bit theory, where you get enough of a momentum and enough of a following that it could actually become, a de facto standard, or at least an option for, a new type of homeschool or a new type of school. So I think you probably have to start with something like Khan Academy, where you'd start with that, with these 17, principles highlighted, that we want to build a system like this. We want to build a hub where you can use things from Khan Academy. You can use classes from anywhere, any online school. You can bring them all to this hub, and we're going to try to implement all of our interactions and rewards, I guess. Anything that you're doing with the system, you want to try to think of with these 17 points and try to make sure that every interaction you have and every reward system you have is kind of managed somehow with these principles. Does that make sense?
Yeah, because like now it's becoming clear that the thing that needs to be created is that hub. So it's
Mm.
like the unified system of connecting all of the alternative education options, which has a unified which has that sort of progression tree, meaning
Yeah.
like classifying all of the potential subjects and like the series of or interconnections of things, using some like terms that are understandable and you can visualize as a map that like in a game you would navigate when you're like leveling up your character, for instance. And
Yeah.
so that you would have to account for all of the, again, the peripheries that already exist, like the actual things that can be learned online or in an alternative fashion. So they would have to be like accounted for in that system, and the progression trees would have to have a system of recognitions and awards based on how far anybody is able to progress as a specialist in any pathway, but also there should be achievements or accomplishments like in interconnecting things. Because like usually something that's more difficult should be higher sort of effort, higher reward type situation. So like in games, when you manage to, for example, it's called like one of the because in games what you can find in many different games are different ways to conceptualize it. So it's like games as such are a good laboratory for these kinds of conceptualizations. One of them, in for instance, like just recently, I bought Diablo 2 Resurrected. They did, fortunately, they did a pretty good job with it. It's really good. The best way to describe it, it's like it's looking like your brain mistakenly believes it looked back then. But then you can just press a button and see direct comparison how terrible it looked back then. But just they managed to capture the atmosphere of the visual aesthetic perfectly. So in there you have synergies. So one of those things is like that you get boosting rewards or amplifiers from things that share something in common or that have interplay that directly amplifies each other. In there would be like, if you have like a fire skill in one class, then all of the fire skills from other classes usually would have some sort of synergy. So like the more you invest into any fire skill, the more it boosts all of the fire skills that you have. So synergy is one model when you could identify between subjects some sort of like synergistic effect, so that you would like present it that way in the tree hub in the pathway, so that it's like people who can quickly find out, the students can quickly discover like which subjects in combination can lead to like really like you get more out of it than if you just studied unconnected to subjects, or much less connected to subjects together. In terms of like, if to be specific, like that it would actually qualify you for a particular job that's rare, stuff like that. So that you can think of synergy in practical terms, I think, in that way. Another model would be something that I'm sort of coming up. I'm not sure, it must have been somewhere, but I'm not sure if I've seen it in any particular game. But that's something that occurred to me in the system that I'm devising, is that it would make sense if you have a that's because that's based on like from mythology or sort of these arcane fantastical things. It's based on the idea of opposition, meaning like you uniting two things that are conventionally thought of as opposite, and if you can integrate those two essentially opposite things, it gives you like together they're so much more rare and powerful because there are so few people who manage to have both. And that's again like you can always translate it into what it means in terms of like why you're learning to be qualified, for instance, for things. So in like at Red Hat or in software companies, one of the most prized professions is I think it's a consultant, because that's a person who has like great people skills, public speaking skills, social skills, and also technical expertise. And those are usually thought of conventionally as opposites. So if you master the technical skills, technical tree in some particular aspect, great. You're definitely qualified for many technical positions. If you master public speaking or like performative arts or sociology, psychology, those things, then like great. You could do a lot of like in terms of art and maybe humane arts and sciences in the academic sense. You can do a lot of that. But if you master both of these, then like you sort of unlock the outcome of like being qualified for something that's much rarer but very needed and therefore highly rewarded. And that's how it can be presented in, because it's not like this is like discovering America as it's like a new, completely new realization. It's that like that's how I think you should be presenting learning pathways to students, even if you conservatively want to like educate them to qualify them. So it's like you can like from the beginning they can know that they can either pursue one path or another, or they will see these synergies and they will see these like mastered oppositions of things that would be indicated as giving them like a much more privileged like in terms of skill and qualification, much more privileged status. So they might know like from the beginning that they may want to be going for that combination. It's like as you would in games, you would be planning your progression ahead of time because you would be seeing like the pathway that you have to take, the steps that you have to take on the way. But more importantly, all of the goals that you can accomplish will be already visible also. So that's like one idea that like how it would be.
Okay, so to bring it back together, so I think everyone's always going to look at education from kind of the end in mind, where what do I want to be when I grow up? A little bit. That's always kind of the end goal. I'm learning math now so that I can learn a little more math and a little more math and then eventually become a scientist or a doctor or a lawyer or businessman, whatever it might be. So I think if we kind of try to build this a little bit from the hub, with that in mind, at least a little bit, what kind of jobs are we really trying to focus on first? And eventually all jobs maybe will be there. But it's like, what types of jobs would be best to train using this kind of a hub or of a format? And at least start with those, kind of like Khan Academy does with more technical things, more computer science related things. We need to figure out what our first jobs should be. And then you could just start with something like that. And if you could kind of actually, one example might be something like a lesson for podcasters, where you're trying to show what type of person becomes a successful podcaster. Maybe you get a few famous podcasters on there to kind of share some of their techniques. And maybe you try to build some kind of test system around how to train to be a podcaster,
Yeah, just
or any job.
I have to make a note because I just thought of something. And I think that could be a way to answer a question immediately. Just to make sure to write it down. Yeah, clumsy. Okay. Almost done. To answer your question, I think you can't start. There are certain things you cannot start with because those require national certifications. So you can't start with doctors, lawyers, anything that can lead a person to die or has a very strict qualifications requirements. So that has to come last. That can only come when you convince a government to be serious about this, because then part of the system or what the hub would connect to wouldn't just be online learning stuff, but it would be also like a medical school or just like maybe like a separate set of courses of particular skills. You would probably start with the lower, less significant ones that don't require that much learning or that sophisticated level of learning, even in those areas. Like you could get much more easily integrated into this education system if you like certify people to be divers or coast guards or something, than you would be for a surgeon. So that's one way of looking practically at where the limitation is at the beginning, which conversely means that you absolutely start with everything that doesn't require an official qualification to do the profession, which is why one of the first ones is Khan Academy, which does math, because that's a kind of skill, like programming skill. Those are the most covered online, most well done online, because most of the people, like most of the companies who are hiring programmers, just care about whether they can do it. They don't care about how they learned it, and the best way to learn it probably still isn't at school. It's by constantly just using a computer and doing stuff. So that's the easiest at the beginning, and you can definitely start with all of arts, like the categories that are actually subjective in terms of their evaluation, and that nobody can probably die if you do it wrong. So like you can get all of arts, which is a great place to start also because arts are the most interesting part, which you can then build around everything. Like you can use to popularize and contextualize everything else. If you get like a solid core of artists that sort of are involved in it and learning from it and affectionate toward it, then they will probably apply their skill to further bolster it. So then make it more marketable, but in the mundane sense, but also make it just whatever is integrated in it, making it more interesting. Then you can also do so we have arts, we have all the computer skills. You can also do many academic stuff actually in terms of humanities. Because again, you don't have to like there's some subcategories that need license to do work, like psychotherapists or psychopathologists or something like that. So there's a specialized group within it that would probably be more difficult to integrate. But if you have like political science, it's just in some sense, who cares what political science is, who does it and why and for what. It's like, yeah, it can have any kind of effect theoretically. but it's not like anybody can actually certify you that you're the right kind of political scientist. Like any government or society that would try to do that would be like the worst anti-liberal, anti-democratic society, just essentially enforcing following a party or something like this. So you get like most of the humanities can immediately be involved also, which I think is a way how to get academics on board or academicians, or make it as academic as you can. Also, not just that, oh, it's just like they're playing with games and painting pictures and just like doing music, these sort of like lame anti-intellectual things. You can involve, of course, mathematics in principle, absolutely 100%, and physics, because again, that's just what you want to produce are people who are able to think in those terms. So there's like service to the society is whatever job they're doing, that doesn't even matter too much. Is that if they have the capacity to think things through in this way, like maybe by thinking while being a patent clerk, they will understand how the universe works. Just like a random example that totally isn't based on a real example. So you can, this is just a benefit to society in general, and something that all the popularizers of science are way for, like 100% on board with anyway, and would like if there's just everybody like liked learning physics and mathematics. So that's just like broadly what you can. But what I wanted to say is the one thing that I came up with that I wrote a note about is that you could sort of, one of these sort of using traditional mystical things to make it make sense in the system. If you use elements like fire, water, air, earth, you can use this prism, like, because that's what it is. It's an analytical prism that makes something into 4 categories. So you can apply it to the goals of the system, the learning goals. There could be like a fire learning goals are, you indicate which things are great to learn for your individual personal benefit. So because that's like a focus on self-improvement.
Yeah.
That's like a one kind of pathway, one kind of skill. And if you can make it in these elements, then it lends to fantasy storytelling very easily. Then you can have water, which is social. So it's like a social / artistic, like so most like focused on understanding emotions, psychology, understanding other people in empathetic social terms, and being able to develop in. I think this would cover many of the things like music and so like things that affect emotions and stuff. So like if this all like if you want to understand emotions, be able to wield emotions, so that this kind of magic. So that's like the whole pathway that you can take, which is clearly in some like closely related to other people. It's not just your goal. It's not just about yourself. It's clearly about you understanding other people. Then you have the sort of air area, which again would be the humanities, and so it's about thinking capacities. So critical thinking, like the core of it. But then also like, do you want to learn a new way how to think about something to be a better thinker? Because that's not aiming for a job. None of these 3 are or have to be about getting a job, but are some of the versions of what some people think or would prefer in an education system to be. So they should be involved in there. So it's not just presented like just a pathway to jobs, because that's the 4th category. That's Earth. You have also the whole prism of, and you can also look at it in a way like, I want to get a job, then I'm following these pathways. So that's why like you get a system which, because normally the problem is that whatever you choose, like some states or societies choose these sort of like a highly theoretical, impractical education that theoretically a lot of things. That's, for instance, in continental Europe, in my part of the world, very common. Then you have the systems who reject this and are like, no. People need to learn practical skills to do jobs so that they can like pay for it. So like, what good is it that you've learned how to translate, I don't know, Mongolian or something? It's like, if it's never, or gender studies, if it's never going to give you a job, that's within the field. So that's another perspective. So what the system needs is the ability to show you can have different perspectives, and depending on which perspective you choose, these are the pathways that would make sense for you. So you don't pick the kind of goal that people should have for them, but give them the ability to pursue or to understand how to pursue all of the kinds of goals that could make sense.
I like it. So kids, for example, when you're just starting as a 4 or 5 year old, you're focused mostly on the fire, maybe the math, the reading, personal development, right? A little bit of water because you've got some social skills there as well that you're developing. The wind, I don't know if that would come. What age would that kind of start? Maybe around when you're starting to
when kids
8 or 9
want.
or 10 when kids
That's the
want. Yeah.
part of the pacing that's individual, especially theoretical thinking skills. Somebody doesn't think they need them, doesn't want them at any point. Somebody wants to start with them and focus on them primarily.
Good point. So, but that would basically generate, as kids get older and start to see themselves as not the center of the universe anymore, and they're starting to think about other perspectives. For me, it was probably around 10 to 12 when I started to really get a little more philosophical. I think that's a general.
It's essentially, that's the age when it makes sense to start debating, which would
Right.
be like one of the principal activities in this domain.
Absolutely. So that's definitely a wind kind of perspective, right? So you'd start with fire and water, mostly fire probably, but a little bit of water, and then wind, and then the earth would of course come last when you're starting to focus on specific tasks for a specific job, whether it's engineer or whatever it might be. That would be very specific to that job. You still do fire, water, and wind, but you've got kind of their earth specific things there that are targeting a specific career path.
Which is
So
funny.
really
Just funny because what the order that you've just mentioned the elements in is their natural order. Fire is number
Right.
1, water is number 2, air is number 3, and earth is number 4.
Yeah. So that makes great sense. And I can definitely see how that could tie into the tree of life with Yggdrasil being kind of, the root maybe being a little more of the fire element. And then you can kind of see the small branches here and there adding to the water. And then the wind would be, I guess the overall structure of the tree as it kind of evolves, it goes in different directions, and then the earth might be the leaves at the end that kind of gather the sustenance from the photosynthesis and actually support the whole tree, right?
Yeah, because then, but when you put it in terms like these, then you can create these narratives that help it
Yeah.
make sense and be memorable.
Yeah, and everyone can kind of see their path again through the tree to become their valuable leaf at the end of the tree, which is a part of the great society of life, and we're all part of this tree together. I really like that. I think that's a great analogy. I think we could kind of take this as a system and continue to develop it, continue to get other ideas on how to pull it together. Maybe start with some kind of website that kind of explained all these things. Definitely have a link to this podcast. But yeah, I think sky's the limit. And
What
this
you
is
can
very
definitely
interesting.
do, what I could definitely do eventually if I could focus on it, is like you can visualize this. You can just like really first write it down analytically, what the pathways are, what it connects to, it sort of makes sense naturally, like a tree that it would start with more like the trunk of the core competencies, and then it would like just divide into many possible outcomes at the end, like you say, the leaves or the fruit. To use a different analogy, like
Fruits is
at
probably
the
better,
end.
yeah. I like it.
So like in this way, I think would be very intuitively understandable. Also, would be sort of suggest like how things should go. But one of the features of these systems is that you can have multiple starting points as well. You don't have to
Right.
have just a single starting point. By which I mean you could have some sort of like as like the tree has branches. It also can have a system of roots that you begin with that are also like varied, but then like sort of converge a little bit, but then separate further types. So we can like start from like a different beginning points. Then everybody will get to learn the common things that everybody probably need to the extent to which that is a thing and exists. And then people will wildly diverge in the outcomes, even though of course it could be like a hyper tree. Like you don't have to, like, you can present it as a tree, but in terms of like concrete structure of the topology of the links, it could be like a very hyperdimensional. Even it doesn't have to be like a 2D map of like just 2D pathways. It could be a bunch of pages. That's how you would present it to people, how you do it in games. You could have like different classes could have their sort of like a segments of it that are their own page, that you don't. So technically, if you wanted to visualize it, wouldn't even be possible to connect it all perfectly and fit it in a readable sort of way in a space. So in 3 dimensions, you would have to have like a diagram of probably more dimensions than 3 to put the whole thing together. It's like probably how, if you have the full, completely, the most complicated, the final version of it. But you can definitely begin with a simple tree metaphor, and you can have generalized versions of it presented as a tree. So like one of the things you would probably do to be able to propose it to people is create some sort of core version of it, basic version of it, and pay somebody probably who's really good with graphics to visualize it, and so that you can present that sort of visual to people of the kind of thing that you think it should be.